Before we begin looking at sculpting terrains, if you take a look in the terrain editor, the terrain I currently have, there's a really huge flat zone. These started appearing around early View 7, and then more so with 7.5. And now in View 8, they seem to be showing up quite frequently. What they are is an incorrect calculation of the force extension. If you ever take a look at the force extension when it's grayed out, the number will change, and it shows the auto-calculated force extension. If I turn off zero edges, you can really see how the terrain is being clipped. So what you can do is turn on force extension and turn it off. And that triggers the calculation and sets the terrain properly. If that doesn't work, and it's not refreshing, you will have to type in a manual value, just pushing the terrain up. Now, this will move it above the pivot within the scene if the value becomes too high. And now what you can see, if I bring the force extension down to 0.1, we're clipping out the entire terrain. So it's raising the Z scale and can often raise the Z position depending on the scale of the terrain. So if you ever run into that problem, you can check on force extension, turn it off. Sometimes you can also make a scale change, and that will help get rid of it. Let's switch over to the Paint tab, and one thing we can see is we now have 3D brushes and 2D brushes. And then the brush tip controls control both 3D and 2D brushes. Added in version 7.5 was the material painting, which allows you to paint a specific material which sets up a mixed material. We'll take a look at that in just a minute. First, let's take a look at some of the different tools. The 2D tools are going to work the same way as they did before. Being able to increase the size of the brush, adjust the flow, and then just either raise the altitude. Now, the lower altitude, or dig as it was called before, has been removed, and instead what we can use is the invert function, which allows us just to invert the direction of the brush, so that way we can push down or pull up. I also want to note that the material painting is only available when you're working in 2D brushes. The softness option has also been removed, and instead we now have the ability to adjust filters to control the fall off of the brush. So if we want to open it up all the way, which would technically be zero softness, then we have a very hard edge brush, or we can pick a different filter. And then these you can customize. Right-click, edit filter to edit it, or you can load filters, reset them, save them. So it works just like any other filter in the program. Since we're working in procedural, I can just reset to remove all of the painted modifications. Now, when you use the altitude, we're now given a plane to show us the altitude range. So we can sample, and we're going to have a nice preview of the altitude range, where before it was really kind of difficult to tell unless you remembered the exact sampled area. We can also see that invert is disabled with the altitude. And I'm just going to go ahead and increase the scale of the terrain editor really quick so we can see this a little larger. And I want to make a few notes about keyboard shortcuts. If we hold down the Control key and left mouse click, we can adjust the flow. And if we hold down the Shift key and left mouse click, moving the mouse up and down to perform both operations, we can adjust the size. So it's a really nice way to quickly access. Also, to invert, we can just hit V on the keyboard. And then all of these other modes, pretty much the first letter is going to be the keyboard shortcut. So with the exception of the Sculpt, which is going to be M on the keyboard, because Smooth is connected to S. So let's take a look at some of these 3D modes. We're going to move over to the Sculpt, And what I'm going to do is just start painting. Now, the Sculpt mode, what we're going to notice is that the first click, if we're taking a look at the line that is coming out from the terrain, this is basically the direction of the brush and the direction of the normal. And when using the Sculpt mode, it becomes fixed depending on the first click. So now we're pointing pretty much straight up, and as I continue to paint, it's going to also continue to point in the direction of the initial normal selection. The freeform mode will conform to the normal and continually change. So that is the main difference between sculpt and freeform. And now, the way this displacement works, and the way we're pulling out this geometry, the more we modify it, the more it's going to increase the resolution. So if you happen to be a ZBrush user, if you've used it before, and you've used 3D sculpting tools, for instance, ZBrush is based on the initial geometry. If you pull it out too far, it's going to become pixelated and just create a really bad look. So you need to make sure you have enough geometry. Well, in View, what it will do is continually subdivide the more the changes are made. So that way we can really pull this out extremely far, and the more modifications, the more stretching there is, the more it's going to increase the resolution. And we can see in this case it's not quite subdividing it entirely, so if you have to, you can switch over to the smooth brush. We can smooth that out. So if you're noticing a lot of distortion, and what we can also see is now that I've done a lot of sculpting, it's saying the terrain is reaching over 1 million three-dimensional polygons. So if I want to continue, I'm just going to click OK, and it's just a little warning. Next to where we see the resolution, we can see plus how many polygons. These polygons are the three-dimensional polygons that you get from painting. I'm going to go ahead and reset this because I did get a little beyond where I wanted. To add a little bit of range to this, I'm going to switch, close this out, and raise up the terrain on the Z for the scale. Go back and edit, and now we'll have some more depth to work with. And I'm also going to go ahead and just decrease the resolution 256 by 256. This is mainly just the preview. The final output is really going to look about the same. So there's a couple other methods we have. And keeping in mind that the invert does work for all the 3D modes. So if we want to sculpt and push the terrain inward, we can just invert. Same thing with freeform. So that way we're pushing in, we can create an overhang that way, and then go back, turn that off, and maybe extend the area. And sometimes it's a good idea to work with some of the existing terrain elements and kind of just embellish them in order to keep from getting any tearing or going too far beyond getting way too many polygons. And as we can see, as it's subdividing, we now have 131K polygons being generated from this displacement. And then we could run a smoothing action if we want to smooth that out. Now if I hit I on the keyboard, it's going to switch over to the inflate, which allows to bulge and really expand some of these areas a little larger, kind of puffing them up. If you have areas that are starting to dip in, once you inflate them, it will overlap and create creases. As we can see, that is happening. So if needed, you can smooth it. And you can see the smoothing action is pretty intense with a high flow and a very large size, so it is a good way to really smooth out an area if needed. And then for some of the smaller areas, we can go in there. The inflate can also be inverted, so it will perform an opposite action, and we can see some tearing in this case. So if we have to smooth that out, just switch over to smoothing, and that works pretty well. So going back and forth between invert and normal is a good way, also keeping in mind those keyboard shortcuts. So if we take a look at the Constrain to clipping range, what I'm going to do is turn that on and start to clip out the terrain. Using the bottom sliders in order to define a range. And then we also want to show those clipping planes, so we're just viewing the planes themselves and we're not actually cutting out the terrain, at least in the preview. If I was to click OK and save it out like this, it will cut out this area of the terrain. But if we want to work on the terrain and just constrain within these modes, we can turn on Constrain to clipping range and now work within just this specific range. So anytime we bring the brush out underneath the lower clipping plane, it's not going to affect the terrain at all. Same thing with just above. Although it will modify anything that's really close to it. We might see some polygons change, really depending where the points are at. So when we smooth out, we can smooth out these higher peaks a little bit easier this way if we have a really sharp ridge. And if you're viewing the scene, what you're going to see is that you cannot see those clipping ranges. Although it will still restrict, we have no preview. So you may need to keep that option off if you're previewing the scene. And that's because in the scene right now, if I click OK, because those clipping areas are applied, that is what it looks like. So if you're only using it for painting, you need to make sure that you switch it back to open it up all the way and also turn off that preview. If we take a look at using an image to define the brush, there have been some changes to the way this is used. So I'm going to go ahead and just load in one of the terrain brushes that comes with the program. That's just to start with. One note I want to make, and this is consistent through previous versions ever since the introduction of the brushes, these do need to be inverted. White is going to be, in this case, the lowest area, and it is more of an alpha. So defining the opacity amount, white being the most opaque or the most transparent, and is not a transparency map. Now, if we take a look, we can see a slider. And what this is going to do is adjust the polygon count and subdivision based on the image. The higher we raise the slider, the more it's going to subdivide. And so the brushes do work a little bit differently in that respect. So we do need to adjust that quality, and it will very quickly reach very high polygon amounts. We could also set it not to subdivide. And in this case, it doesn't really appear to be doing all that much. So you may want to work with a very low mode for this in order to get it to work correctly and not reach a really, really high polygon count for the 3D geometry. And if we switch to the 2D mode, that slider is turned off. and the brushes now work like they used to. So if you want to use a custom brush, sometimes it's easier to do it in a 2D mode, raising it upward, and then maybe modify it a little more with the sculpting tools afterwards. Otherwise, I mean, you can run into some large issues, and you may need to increase that terrain resolution in order to get the brush to turn out looking a little bit better. I'm going to go ahead and just reset this, get rid of all those changes, turn off the image for the brush, and let's take a look at the material painting, which was added in 7.5. What we can do is first, once we click to select the material, material 1, it's going to ask us to choose our material. I'm going to go to Material Layers and just choose the large scale pale grass. And now the second material is the material that was already defined. So the initial material that was on the terrain. If we open up the material, we're going to see a mixed material was created. If I double click, we can load in. Let's go ahead and use large scale rock for material 1. Ignore the alpha information since it's a material layer which has embedded alpha. And now we can see that the entire terrain at the moment is all the large scale rock. Go back, edit, and now we can start to apply additional effects. So what we can do is paint directly onto the terrain the distribution that we want to have for these different materials. So if we just want this side to be applied, click OK. We can take a look. I'm going to go ahead and adjust my lighting a little, lift the sun up, rotate it around. We can see that edge. And I'll go ahead and render that. And we could just see that very simple blend between the two materials. If we take a look at the distribution of material 1 and 2, what we're seeing is that image that was created as a projected texture map. So we have it set to the automatic mapping mode, and it's going to use interpolation type bilinear, which is going to work the best. You can also see that the smooth blending strip is at 100%, and we're using a simple blend. So if it was smoothed a little too much, you can reduce the smooth blending strip to make it a little bit sharper. Now, the scale of this image is going to be defined by the pixel resolution of the terrain. So if you need a higher quality material distribution, you will need to increase the pixel resolution of the terrain. And that applies for procedurals and standard terrains, both working the same. If we use the Apply 2D brushing, it'll also allow us to paint at the exact same time we are changing the material. So if I want to switch to maybe the effect mode, go ahead and turn off the brush, the image, and we could paint some pebbles on. So this way we're now applying a 2D effect, so we're manipulating the shape of the terrain as well as applying the material change. So that's a really cool way to work back and forth. You could use the different erosion effects and paint at the same time. Now you can also control the effects within the Effects tab to manipulate the material. And I'll show that in just a sec. So if we wanted to switch now to material 1 and paint back over, turn off the 2D brushing, and that way we could paint back over it to erase anything. I do want to note that the reset is not going to manipulate this image and distribution. So the easiest way, or one way, would be to just choose one of the materials, make sure no 2D brushing is applied, and just paint over it. So that's one way to kind of reset that material distribution. The other way is to And as we can see, if we go to the Links tab, the preview, or see that actual image that was created, we're going to see that that didn't actually take care of everything. One thing that can be done is just to delete that, actually, undo, because that did delete the actual object itself. If we go into the distribution of the material, what we can do is hit the trash can to clear out that image, click OK, go back, and in this case, because no resolution is defined, we're going to click yes to resample the existing map, which actually isn't going to do anything to the map, and in this case it looked like it removed the entire terrain. So I'm going to escape and go back into the material, and instead of using the trash can, go ahead and just delete the node entirely. So now that projected texture map is gone, we can edit the object, and it should restore us to where we're at and disable the material painting. It'll also remove any distribution we have between the materials, so you might need to save materials first. It's just another way to reset. And now we can go back and paint. So let's take a look at the effects. I'm just going to switch really quick and switch to the top view, just make sure that everything is getting covered. Click OK, and we should see that new map coming up, and it is perfectly black, which means we could also export this. If you want to work on it in a different program, import it back in, although it could get replaced if you go to paint over it. So we'll go back and edit, select Material 2, apply 2D brushing, and go to the Effects tab. So now we can run different effects erosions over this terrain. I'm going to reduce the image quality at first, do a diffusive or a dissolve erosion, and now we can see that effect being applied. Go ahead and apply some additional effects over this, and using the river valley, which does take a lot longer to process than the other effects. We can see that showing up. Gives us a really nice distribution. I also want to note, if we undo, it will not undo the material, just the modifications to the terrain. So that's one thing to pay attention to, because the undo is really not for this material painting. It hasn't really been implemented, unfortunately. So if you need to, like I was saying, delete that map or paint over it in order to get it reset. So let's take a look at this distribution. We now have two of the same material, so I'm going to mix. And what actually happened, because I deleted the existing material map, it did add a new mixed material for one of the existing materials. So I'm going to select this and swap. So the grass is material 1, change this to a simple material, and the distribution is still on the top. If it does get copied over, you may have to copy the function and paste it. That can sometimes happen for the way the distribution works. I'm going to change this smooth blending strip a little. I'm just going to do a quick preview. We can take a look at the distribution and see that it now has been driven by that effect erosion. So it is pretty cool. And because the texture map itself is what is synchronized to the terrain editor, we can make connections in between if you want to add a filter, and it'll just update the map rather than replacing anything. And then you can choose different blending modes if needed. And I'm just going to make sure there's no alpha applied. And now we can see a little bit of a sharper edge. So you can go in there and manipulate and run filters. Also important to keep in mind that since we are working with the procedural terrain, that procedural is running underneath our image manipulation and effects. which normally effects are used more frequently with a standard terrain, although we can modify that procedural underneath to get a little bit of extra detail on those painted areas. I am going to make one really quick note. That is, because I did add that filter, when I go into the terrain editor, it was no longer allowing me to paint the terrain, use material painting. So it looks like that direct connection is needed while you're still working on the distribution. So if you need to extract and preserve it, make any changes, using the links you can export it, maybe reset the material, and do it over again, and that way you don't have to worry about losing that information. Or you can just copy the function and reset the material and then paste it back in. And that way you can separate the map, but really probably the best thing to do would be to export it when you're done, just to make sure it does not get replaced and you don't lose that information. Exporting that link will also allow you to load it in to control ecosystem population if you wanted to control the density in that way too. So really quickly I could just copy this function, add an ecosystem layer, and control the density, the variable density, by pasting that image. And it does look like our scale needs to be pulled down just a little here. And now we can control an ecosystem using the same distribution as the material. If you want to have an overall population that isn't linked to just an area of the mixed material, because you could also just apply the ecosystem directly to one of those material layers. Increase density, and that way it's just part of the area of the mix, so just on that specific material. So there are a lot of different ways you can use those different maps that are generated.